So I want you to picture something for a second. It is late summer, August 1976.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, exactly. You walk into a hobby shop. Maybe it smells a little like, pipe tobacco and old cardboard. And you see this mysterious digest-sized booklet sitting on the rack.
Right.
It has this plain brown cover, some really classic, slightly rough fantasy art, and it looks exactly like all the other supplements for the original Dungeons & Dragons game. But if you look really closely at the cover, there is one glaring omission.
It is missing number.
It doesn't have a number. It is universally known today as Supplement V, but the cover just flat out doesn't say that. It's like the phantom book of that original run. We are talking, of course, about Swords and Spells.
A completely fascinating, often ignored, and deeply flawed masterpiece.
Hold on, you just called it a masterpiece a second ago. But I know for a fact, because we've been researching this deep dive all week, that this book contains a mathematical error so bad it essentially breaks the game.
It really does.
So how can it be a masterpiece if the rules literally do not work?
Well, that is the core paradox of Swords and Spells. It is a book that almost nobody actually played as written precisely because the math was broken, but practically everyone playing the game bought it anyway.
Right.
On the surface, the subtitle bills itself as Rules for Large-Scale Miniatures Battles, which, that sounds incredibly dry.
Very dry.
But when you actually crack this thing open, you realize it is so much more than that. It serves as this functional bridge between the game's roots in tabletop wargaming, specifically the chainmail rules, and the highly codified rules of advanced Dungeons & Dragons that were just around the corner.
So it is kind of the missing link.
It absolutely is. And if we zoom out to the bigger picture, the mission for our deep dive today is to understand that this isn't just a dusty old rulebook. It is an artifact of a philosophical war.
Oh, war. Yeah, a massive clash in gaming history. This book represents the tension between tactical rigidity, the desire for strict math, and order and narrative potential. We are going to explore how it tried to reconcile those two things, why it failed spectacularly on the math front, and how it accidentally fixed the magic system for basically everyone.
Okay, I love that. Let us unpack this from the top. First, the mystery of the missing number. Why wasn't it called Supplement V? Did they just forget what number they were on?
No, it was a classic case of a company just completely painting themselves into a corner.
How so?
Earlier in 1976, TSR released Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. And in the introduction to that specific book, they explicitly wrote, in black and white, this is the last supplement.
Oh, wow. Spoke way too soon.
They really thought they were done. They thought the game was a complete finished product.
Yeah.
But almost immediately, they realized they had a massive logistical problem on their hands as players started hitting higher levels. They desperately needed a mass combat system.
Right, because the game was changing. Exactly. So they wrote Swords and Spells, but they had to market it really carefully so fans wouldn't call them out. They slapped that subtitle on it. Rules for Large-Scale Miniatures Battles, basically to pretend it was a standalone war game and not Supplement V.
But looking at the format, the size of the book, the fact that it was edited by Tim Kask, it is absolutely Supplement V.
It is the secret sibling they tried to hide in the attic.
Totally. Now, let us look at the credits page, because this is where the behind-the-scenes drama really starts to bubble up. The title page lists Gary Gygax as the author, which is standard. But then, right under development, we see two specific names, Dave Arneson and Rob Kuntz.
And that inclusion of Dave Arneson there is heavy, really heavy.
Why is it heavy? Weren't Arneson and Gygax the co-creators of the whole game? You'd expect them to be working together.
You would, but by 1976, that creative marriage was effectively over. It was fractured beyond repair. You have to understand for this deep dive that these two men had completely different, fundamentally opposed design philosophies.
Okay, bring that down for us.
Arneson was the spark of life for the game. He was the guy who pushed for individual role-playing, for deep immersion, for what was known as the free Kriegspiel style of play.
Okay, free Kriegspiel. That sounds like an obscure German heavy metal band. What does that actually mean in terms of playing a game at a table?
It is a 19th century German military wargaming concept. In gaming terms, it means you do not look up a highly specific rule for every single action your character takes. You trust the referee, the game master, to use common sense and make a ruling right there on the fly.
Got it. So if I tell the GM, hey, I want to swing from this tavern chandelier and drop kick the goblin,
Exactly. Arneson would not halt the game to consult a swinging modifier chart. He
I
would just
got it.
say, yeah, that sounds awesome. Roll a dexterity check to see if you pull it off.
Right. It is all about the improvisation, the vibes approach to gaming.
Pure vibes. But Gygax was the exact opposite. Gygax wanted structure. He wanted a robust system that could be packaged, sold, codified, and played uniformly in official tournaments across the country.
So Swords and Spells leans into that.
Swords and Spells is quintessentially Gygaxian. It seeks to impose strict mathematical order on the absolute chaos of a fantasy battle. It is filled with dense charts and tables.
So if this book is just pages of dense math, which is the exact opposite of how Arneson played, why is Arneson's name proudly listed under development?
It was highly likely a contractual obligation or maybe a weird peace offering. At this exact time, Arneson was basically leaving the company amidst all these messy legal disputes and royalty fights. He had very little to do with the actual crunch of this book. Rob Kuntz, the other name on that page, he was the one really in the trenches helping Gygax figure out the complex conversion rates.
And oh boy, there are so many conversion rates. But before we get totally lost in the math, and I promise you, listener, we are going to get to the math. Let us talk about the problem of scale. Why do they even need this book in 1976?
That is a great question.
Because today, if you sit down to play a fantasy RPG, the endgame is usually pretty personal. You fight a massive boss in a throne room, you save the world, maybe your character retires and opens a little tavern in the woods.
That is the modern narrative arc, yes. But the expectation back then was totally different. They called it name level.
Name level, right?
When a fighter hit 9th level in the original rules, they gained the title of Lord. When a magic user hit 11th level, they became a wizard. The expectation wasn't that you just kept crawling through progressively deeper underground dungeons.
You have to graduate.
You did. You were supposed to spend your gold to build a massive stronghold, clear the surrounding wilderness of monsters, and start commanding literal armies. You transitioned from being a wandering mercenary to being a head of state.
You became a general.
Precisely. But here is the logistical nightmare that Gygax ran into. Let us say your 9th level lord has a personal retinue of 50 human archers. And while patrolling your lands, you run into a warband of 200 angry orcs.
Okay, a decent-sized skirmish.
Under the standard rules they were using for dungeon crawling, every single attack requires rolling a 20-sided die.
Wait, so for 250 individual troops on the field, you were rolling one by one?
Yes, it would literally take hours just to resolve 1 minute of combat. It was physically impossible to run a satisfying war that way. So Gygax had to invent a solution. And what he came up with is what we call the diceless abstraction.
Diceless? In a tabletop RPG? That feels slightly sacrilegious.
It is almost diceless. The entire combat system relies on the law of large numbers. Gygax reasoned that if you have 200 guys swinging swords at each other, you do not need to simulate every individual swing. You just need to figure out the statistical average of what would happen.
So he just skipped the rolling.
He did. Swords and Spells uses percentage tables instead. You cross-reference the attacking unit's level and weapon against the defending unit's armor class. The table then tells you exactly what percentage of the defending unit is killed. No to-hit rolls required.
That is wild. It is like they invented a spreadsheet calculator before digital spreadsheets even existed.
It was brilliant in its own way, and it operated on a rigid 10-to-1 ratio, so one physical miniature figure on your table represented 10 actual soldiers in the game world.
But wait, here's where it gets tricky. How do you handle the player characters? Because my 9th level lord isn't a generic unit of 10 guys. He is one specific guy. Does he just disappear into the infantry line?
Not at all. And this is where the math gets incredibly specific to integrate single heroes. The system gave high-level characters a damage output relative to a full unit. For example, the rules explicitly state that a 4th level fighter, which the game calls a hero, inflicts exactly 40% or 0.40 of a standard unit's damage output.
So a single 4th level guy is mathematically worth 4 regular soldiers.
Roughly, yes. And a 12th level wizard, they score 1.2 times the base damage of a full unit.
Wow.
So it allowed your beloved high-level characters to absolutely carve through enemy armies without you having to roll endless dice. You just did the multiplication. It preserved that heroic fantasy feel while making mass combat mechanically playable.
I love that concept. This is basically video game logic, where the hero has a specific DPS rating, but they were doing this with pencil and paper in the 70s?
It was highly innovative for its time. But as complex as swords and arrows were, the biggest headache for the designers wasn't melee combat, it was magic.
Oh, right. Because in early editions, a spell like Fireball does not just hit a specific square footage, it expands to fill its total volume, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Now, if you are deep inside a 10 by 10 dungeon corridor, that is perfectly fine. The fire expands, it hits the stone walls, and it stops.
But outdoors in a war game.
Exactly,
Yeah.
in an open grassy field with no walls. Theoretically, based on the pure reading of the original rules, a single fireball could expand outward almost infinitely until its total cubic volume was reached. You could wipe out an entire advancing army with one single third-level spell.
Which kind of completely ruins the point of a war game.
Right.
Why spend hours painting miniatures and building an army if the opposing wizard can just nuke the entire board on turn one?
It totally breaks the game. So swords and spells had to introduce a rigid mathematical ceiling for magic. They firmly capped the damage.
How did they calculate a damage cap without a computer?
Okay, let us look at the actual example provided in the book. It is a bit crunchy, but stay with me. Let us say a 10th level magic user casts a fireball at an enemy unit of 8 figures. Because of the 10-to-1 ratio, that is 80 orcs.
Okay, casting at 80 orcs.
The base damage is calculated by taking the spell level, which is 10, and multiplying it by the average roll of a 6-sided die, which is 3.5. So 10 times 3.5 gives you 35 base damage.
35 damage. I am following you so far.
Then you apply the wargame scale modifier, which is set at 5. So 35 times 5 equals a hard cap of 165 points of damage. That is it. You mathematically cannot inflict more than that.
So it turned the wizard into a piece of heavy artillery. Devastating, for sure, but no longer a tactical nuke that ends the scenario instantly.
Precisely.
But I was reading ahead in the sources about the saving throws against these spells, and this sounded like an absolute nightmare to play. Fractional saves.
Oh man, this is exactly where players threw the rulebook across the room. If a unit successfully saved against a spell, they didn't just take half damage like you do in modern gaming, they took 1/16 of the total damage.
1/16. Are you kidding me? So
Oh.
you had to do actual long division at the table during a game.
Oh, it gets worse. If they failed the save, they took 1/8 of the damage.
So just imagine this scenario for a second. You are in the middle of this epic, sweeping fantasy battle. Dragons are roaring overhead, arrows are completely blotting out the sun, the tension is incredibly high, and you have to stop everything, pull out a piece of scratch paper, and calculate 35 divided by 16 just to see if the front line of goblins dies.
It completely killed the pacing at the table. People are sitting there saying, okay, carry the 2, that is roughly 2.1875 damage.
That is just brutal.
It really was, but Gygax loved it because it was so precise. And to be fair to him, it did add a layer of tactical depth that simply wasn't present in the game before.
That is true. Despite the massive math headache, it did introduce some really cool tactical concepts, like readied spells, right?
Yes, that was a huge precursor to modern counterplay. You could declare that your wizard was readying a spell to release instantaneously when a specific trigger happened.
Which means you had to really plan ahead.
Exactly, because the turn sequence itself was the real key to the game. It was this incredibly rigid 10-phase turn order. Movement, then magic, then melee, then morale, and so on. You had to carefully manage your momentum. You couldn't just react instantly to whatever your opponent did.
And speaking of reacting, we absolutely have to talk about the mathematical plot armor.
Yeah.
Because this is honestly my favorite part of these combat rules.
The missile modifiers. This is genuinely brilliant game design.
So paint the picture for the listener. If you have 100 enemy archers on a hill and they all fire their bows at a massive dragon, what happens mechanically?
The rules apply a minus 50% casualty modifier. Because it is a giant, heavily armored, scaly beast, it makes logical sense that arrows would bounce off.
But what if those same 100 archers fire at a lone 4th-level player character running across the open field?
The rules apply a minus 90% adjustment.
Minus 90%. That is incredible.
It really is. The game essentially assumes the hero is dynamically dodging, weaving through the dirt, and blocking arrows with a shield like an action movie star. It made it so your beloved character, the one you spent months leveling up, didn't just get turned into a pincushion in the very first round of a mass battle.
Right, it preserves the narrative importance of the main characters within this cold, hard simulation. It mathematically proves that heroes are just built different. The numbers literally bend to keep them alive.
They do. But if you look at the sample scenarios in the back of the book, it becomes clear that the villains are operating on a completely different level of power, too.
Yes, the sample game. We have to talk about the massive battle example at the end of the book. It is framed as the good wizard versus the evil high priest.
The classic EHP. It is a fundamental archetype of the genre.
But this isn't just some guy standing in a robe waving a staff. Describe the actual army this priest is bringing to the fight.
It is staggering in scale. The evil high priest has a specified army budget of 16,874 points.
That sounds extremely expensive.
It represents a massive military-industrial complex, and the composition of this evil army is pure, uncut pulp fantasy. We are not just talking about a disorganized mob of low-level orcs. The text specifically describes disciplined phalanxes of heavy infantry, supported on the flanks by wolf and goblin cavalry, all being led into battle by manticores.
Wait, manticores? Like the giant lion monsters with the bat wings, the scorpion tails? They are the ones commanding the cavalry.
That is the exact aesthetic they were pushing. It really defined the early Dungeons & Dragons world, not just as a series of isolated caves where you fight goblins for silver pieces, but as a vast geopolitical landscape. The evil high priest is not just a cult leader hiding in a basement. He is a legitimate head of state.
It fundamentally changes how you view the end game of these early campaigns. It wasn't about grinding for better loot anymore. It was about strategic deterrence. You literally needed your party's wizard to hit max level just to stop the neighboring country's manticore cavalry from crossing your borders.
Exactly. It raises a really important question about the intended scope of the game. The mechanics were explicitly telling the player, this is where your story is headed. You are destined to become a king or commanding general.
Now here's the ultimate twist of this whole deep dive. Despite all this incredible world building, the manticores, the grand strategy, very few people actually played the wargame part of swords and spells.
Very, very few. It was just too complex. The fractional math was way too heavy for a casual Friday night, and you needed a massive, expensive collection of miniatures to run it properly.
But almost everyone who played the core RPG went out and bought this book anyway. Why is that?
We call it the stealth errata. This is the true secret value of Supplement V. You have to remember that the original rules published in 1974, the famous 3 Little Brown Books, were incredibly vague.
Generously speaking, they were vague.
They were full of huge structural holes. Spells were often listed with just a cool name and absolutely no mechanical details. Take the sleep spell, for example. In the original game, there was literally no duration listed for how long the spell lasted.
Wait, back up. You are saying that before this supplement came out, if my character cast sleep on a room full of guards, the official rule did not say when they woke up.
Zero guidance whatsoever. You would have arguments at every single table across the country. Players would ask, do they sleep for an hour, a full year? Do they sleep until I physically kick them awake? It was left entirely up to the game master to invent a ruling, which naturally led to massive arguments.
Oh, I can easily imagine the fights over that.
So swords and spells contained what they called a master spell chart, ostensibly for the wargame rules, but observant game masters quickly realized it was actually just the missing patch notes for the main role-playing game. It finally fixed the sleep spell to last exactly 4 to 16 turns.
A concrete number. Finally.
Exactly. It explicitly set Detect Magic to last for 2 turns. It fixed the range of the Hold Portal spell to 10 scale yards. It finally gave the magic system the physics engine it was desperately missing.
So players were walking into hobby shops and buying a complex war game they had no intention of playing just to get the patch notes for their weekend dungeon crawl.
100%. If you wanted to know how Magic Missile actually functioned in a quantified, measurable way, you absolutely needed this little brown booklet. And it wasn't just spells either. It was the monster matrix.
Right, the fighting capability chart.
Yeah. It explicitly distinguished between what it called formation troops, like disciplined gnolls, and monsters, like bugbears or ogres who fight as loose skirmishers. This became an invaluable tool for game masters trying to balance encounters or introduce weird new creatures like gremlins or wax golems into their campaigns.
Okay, so it was super useful, but we cannot let Gygax completely off the hook here. We teased a catastrophic error at the very beginning of this deep dive, a howling blunder, as game designer Lawrence Schick called it later. What exactly went so wrong with the math?
It was the core resolution engine of the book itself. Gygax attempted to cleanly port the Dungeons & Dragons armor class system over into these new wargaming percentage tables, but he made a fatal design mistake. He inadvertently double-counted the defensive modifiers.
Double-counted? How do you mean? Make that make sense for us.
Think of it like going to buy a new car. The sticker price on the window already includes the sales tax, but then you get into the finance office, and the cashier adds the tax onto the final price a second time.
So you are paying twice for the exact same thing.
Exactly. In the game system, the primary armor class table already assumed it was inherently difficult to hit a soldier wearing heavy plate mail. That was baked into the baseline percentage. But then Gygax added a secondary penalty column that penalized the attacker again, simply because the target was wearing plate mail.
Oh no, that is a massive oversight.
The mathematical result was that heavy infantry troops in full plate mail carrying shields became statistically invincible against standard weapon attacks. You could have a disorganized army of 5,000 peasants attacking a tiny unit of heavy infantry, and mathematically they might literally never score a single hit.
That seems extremely problematic for a game entirely focused on simulating war.
It completely broke the simulation. Unless you had high-level magic or giant monsters throwing boulders, the heavy infantry simply would not die. Schick and other designers pointed this out years later. They noted that for all the development credit listed on the title page, apparently nobody actually playtested the raw math of the armor tables deeply enough to catch this massive flaw.
That is honestly heartbreaking. You have this incredibly grand vision of order and mathematical structure, and one simple spreadsheet error basically tanks the whole thing.
And this error perfectly coincided with a massive shift in gaming culture. By late 1976 and into 1977, the core player base was just moving on. They didn't really want to push hundreds of little lead miniatures around a ping pong table anymore. They wanted to be Aragorn. They wanted deep, personal narrative immersion.
Right. Author David M. Ewalt actually called this book the odd man out in the game's history.
And he is completely right. It was a glance backward. It was looking back at chainmail and the roots of wargaming, desperately trying to perfect that system, right at the exact moment the broader hobby was sprinting away from wargames and into pure role-playing.
So bringing it to the modern day, does anyone actually play swords and spells now? Or is it purely just a collector's item sitting on a shelf?
Within the old-school Renaissance, the OSR crowd, they really revere it as a piece of rules archaeology. They love analyzing it. But practically speaking, no, nobody plays it. It is fundamentally unplayable as written because of that double counting math error. If people want old-school mass combat today, they usually just revert to the original chainmail rules, or they use the much cleaner war machine rules that TSR released later in the 1980s. But swords and spells remains this essential frozen moment in time.
It is like looking at a fossil record of the game's awkward teenage years. It is trying so hard to be a tactical war game and a narrative RPG at the exact same time.
And ultimately succeeding at neither, but crucially providing the structural glue, those master spell charts that finally held the entire Magic system together for a generation of players.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what does this all mean for the listener? Why should you care about a funky brown booklet from 1976 that got its own math wrong?
I think it serves as a brilliant reminder of the sheer scale of ambition from that era. Gygax wasn't just trying to build a fun little dungeon crawler for a Friday night. He was trying to build a comprehensive world simulator. He wanted the magic to follow strict physical laws, and he wanted the fantasy armies to have realistic logistics. Even if the underlying math was completely busted, the core intent was to treat fantasy warfare seriously.
It wasn't just a matter of hand-waving it and saying, oh, the wizard kills them all. It was a demand to calculate the exact blast radius.
Exactly. It demanded rigor from the fantasy genre.
Well, this has been quite a trip. From a missing Roman numeral on a cover to Manicore cavalry to forcing players to do long division just to resolve a fireball.
And never forget those 1/16th fractional saving throws.
I'm going to try my hardest to forget them, honestly. Before we sign off, what is one final provocative thought for our listeners to chew on?
I keep going back to that evil high priest battle report in the back of the book. 16,000 points of specialized troops. If the original intent of tabletop role-playing was to end with you commanding that incredible level of geopolitical power, have we actually shrunk the scope of our fantasy imagination in modern gaming? We focus so intensely on the individual hero, now optimizing the specific build, exploring the personal backstory arc. But maybe we have lost the absolute grandeur of being a true lord, commanding a nation, and worrying about the macro politics of a fantasy world. Maybe we should zoom out a little more often.
That is a genuinely fascinating thought. Maybe it's time for all of us to buy some more miniatures and build an army. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into swords and spells. We will catch you on the next one.